Ulrich, do you want to say a few words about this, just to center who we are?
Before David introduces James, I welcome you all to the Center for Religion and Global Citizenry at UW-Madison. And so we at the center train undergraduates in religious literacy and to communicate beyond the boundaries of their own faith or non-faith tradition in order to become better citizens. But we also run the IRG, the Interdisciplinary Religion Group, and that's what is happening right now. We are the IRG right now. That is a group for graduate students and faculty to show their work in progress, share their work as long as it is in the area or pertains to religious studies. This is a forum, this is a space where we can do this at UW. We are not that old. We do this now in this format for about, it's the second year. We did this before and then picked it up again last year. And we are very glad to have you and very glad to have a special guest today who's going to share very fresh, very exciting work. And with that, welcome everyone. And David, you can welcome James.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Our speaker today, one of our IRG's own. I was even just reflecting that I think when we did meet once in person last year, about a year ago, last February, I think I was seated next to you, so I saw you there. And in any case, James Ungureanu is a historian in residence at the George L. Massey Program in History at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where we are. He's also an honorary research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Queensland, where he earned his PhD in religious studies. Before he got his PhD, did a double BA in philosophy and religious studies at UC Davis and an MA in the history of Christianity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. As an intellectual historian, James's research interests range over the history of Christian thought from antiquity to the present. He's published articles in such journals as Notes and Records of the Royal Society of the History of Science, Notes and Queries, Zygon, Science and Christian Belief, Church History, Historical Studies in the Natural Sciences, and Fide et Historia, Science, Religion, and the Protestant Tradition, Retracing the Origins of Conflict, was published in 2019 by the University of Pittsburgh Press, and this is what he'll be presenting on today. Please join me in welcoming our speaker for today, James Ungureanu.
Thanks, guys. I will share my screen here, so give me a second. Let me see if I can do this right. And then, what do you guys see? Do you guys see the first slide? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so the title of my talk is taken from my book, as David mentioned, Science, Religion, and the Protestant Tradition, Retracing the Origins of Conflict. Now, it's a big book with many complex and interlocking questions, but the article that was sent out, I believe, provides something of a summary, and this is what I'm going to do tonight as well. I'm going to summarize its contents, and I hope you find it useful. So in a nutshell, the conflict thesis is the idea that science and religion are at war, or they're fundamentally in conflict. Always have been, always will be. This is a history of warfare. And in that sense, it is a historical argument. Most proponents of the conflict thesis maintain if you look back in history, particularly Christian history, but not exclusively Christian history, if you look back in history at every moment in the advance of science or new learning, religion has attempted to oppose, sort of oppress and deny that progress. Now, historians of science typically trace the origins of the conflict thesis to the late 19th century. Specifically among Anglo-American writers. For instance, many scholars point to the scientific naturalists, a Victorian clique made up of biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, physicist John Tyndall, and evolutionary philosopher Herbert Spencer, among others, who supposedly employed the thesis in their attempt to professionalize and secularize the sciences. More precisely still, most scholars point to New York University chemist John William Draper and historian and first president of Cornell University, Andrew Dickson White. They claim, most historians of science claim these are the co-founders of a philosophy of history that has endorsed the belief that science and religion have been and always will be at odds. So let me talk briefly about the backgrounds. So John William Draper was actually born in England. He studied chemistry and medicine at University College London, known then as London University, which was established around the 1820s. His father died almost as soon as he started his studies, though. So he emigrated to the US and because he had family living in Virginia for some time at that point. But he established himself very quickly as a leading scientist in America. He taught at a couple of different schools before becoming head of chemistry at New York University in 1837. He was also known for his photochemistry and is thought to be the first person to take a photograph of the human face, and this being his sister, Dorothy Draper. He was also known as one of the earliest to practice astrophotography, and here is an 1840 photograph of the moon that he took. But Draper soon gave up chemistry and science in general for history. In an 1865 letter to John Tyndall, who I mentioned earlier, he wrote, "I have given up physics and chemistry, finding as I grow older, history more to my taste." He goes on to complain that scientific papers cost a world of labor, yet they are read by nobody. Physics, no one reads. History, everyone reads, he tells Tyndall. So after devoting many years to scientific research, Draper felt like he wasn't getting the recognition that he deserved. So naturally, he turned more to historical pursuits. Now, in his History of the Conflict, which was published in 1875, Draper claimed that the history of science was a narrative of the conflict of two contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on the one side, and the compression arising from traditionary faith and human interests on the other. He went on to explain that faith is in its nature unchangeable, stationary, whereas science is in its nature progressive, and eventually a divergence, a conflict, if you will, between them must take place. Now, Andrew Dickson White was never a scientist. He was a man of literature. He was born in New York right around the time Draper and his family were making their way to America from England. White's parents believed he was destined for the pulpit. His father sent him to an Episcopalian college, which later became Hobart College near Rochester. But White found the curriculum at Hobart uninspiring. He actually ran away and demanded to be sent to Yale College. They sort of had a falling out over this, but his father ultimately relented and sent him to Yale to study history and English literature. After college, he went on this grand 3-year European tour, visiting places like Oxford and Cambridge. He spent some time studying in France, in Berlin, and then several months exploring, backpacking, Switzerland, Austria, Italy, before coming back to the States to do postgraduate work at Yale. In 1857, at the remarkable age of 25, he was appointed history professor at the University of Michigan. At the outbreak of the Civil War, though, he resigned his post and was unexpectedly nominated and elected for New York State Senate. It was during this time that he met Ezra Cornell, who sort of made a fortune in the telegraph business. And being a Quaker, Cornell was eager to get rid of some of that money. So together, White and Cornell founded Cornell University in New York. White became its first president, but he was sort of an absentee president. He had a number of diplomatic appointments, first in Santo Domingo, then in Berlin and Russia, and eventually resigned the presidency in 1885 to work exclusively on research and writing. But before all that, White was known for his Battlefields of Science lecture in 1869, in which he traced the great, quote, the great sacred struggle for the liberty of science. So in this lecture, he reviews one by one the battles, the so-called battles fought in cosmography, astronomy, chemistry, anatomy, geology, and so on. He took this lecture and expanded it to a book in 1876 entitled simply The Warfare of Science. And then after resigning from Cornell, he spent decades expanding this idea even further, which eventually turned into his 2-volume masterpiece, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology and Christendom, which was published in 1896. But his basic argument remained the same throughout. He wrote, in all modern history, interference with science in the supposed interest of religion, no matter how conscientious such interference may have been, has resulted in the direst evils both to religion and to science, and invariably. On the other hand, all untrammeled scientific investigation, no matter how dangerous to religion, some of its stages may have seemed for the time, has invariably resulted in the highest good, both of religion and of science. So according to historians of science, Draper and White set the terms of debate. Although few cite them today, most who claim there is some sort of conflict between science and religion usually draws from one or more of the narratives or episodes of conflict set out in their respective books. But I don't think that's quite right. In my book, having closely examined their work, and the context of their work, I've come to a different conclusion. Draper and White did not, in fact, argue for a conflict between science and religion. There has been sort of this fundamental misunderstanding of their work, their intentions, and really the context in which they presented their arguments. For example, most historians think that Draper in particular had something against the Roman Catholic Church, and no doubt he did, but really so did everyone else at the time. Anti-Catholic sentiment was at its height in the 19th century, especially in America. So I don't think that really tells us much about Draper's intentions in the book. In terms of White, historians argue that religious criticism of his beloved university set him off, but White had already formulated his views prior to founding Cornell University. He was in fact teaching this narrative, his narrative, to undergraduate students at the University of Michigan. So something else is going on here, and that the conventional view or interpretation fails to reveal. And it fails because, simply put, it ignores what Draper and White actually said they were doing. For example, Draper's History of Conflict was largely a condensed version of previously published work. Most importantly, Draper had published his History of the Intellectual Development of Europe in 1863. And this is a 2-volume work. It's massive in scope. And here he made a crucial distinction that most historians of science have either forgotten or really just ignored. In discussing the so-called paganization of Christianity under Emperor Constantine, Draper distinguished between Christianity and, quote, ecclesiastical organizations. The former, he wrote, is a gift of God. The latter are the product of human exigencies and human invention, and therefore open to criticism, or, if need be, to condemnation. He argued that the paganization of Christianity has resulted in what he called the tyranny of theology over thought, and declared that those who had known what religion was in the apostolic days might look with boundless surprise on what was now engrafted upon it and was passing under its name. Even his notorious History of Conflict, under closer inspection, he continues to make these distinctions. He argued that he would only consider the orthodox or extremist views and not the moderate ones. He even expressed concern that traditionary faith was leading the intelligent classes to give up on religion altogether. His narrative, in short, was intended to show that the decline of religious faith was a direct consequence of a politicized, or how he put it, materialized Christianity, not science. White shared much of the same sentiments in his historical narrative. History showed, again, according to White, that the interference with science and the supposed interests of religion was evil both to religion and science. So White is sort of separating religion from theology. And by separating religion from theology, White could denounce that the most mistaken of all mistaken ideas was the conviction that religion and science are enemies. While science has conquered dogmatic theology, he argued, it will go hand in hand with religion. So the whole point of his narrative, he later wrote in his autobiography, which was published in 1905, was to strengthen religious teachers by enabling them to see some of the evils in the past, which for the sake of religion itself, they ought to guard against in the future. In other words, both Draper and White were trying to find possible ways to reconcile Christian faith and science, or modernity, not promote their conflict or warfare. Interestingly enough, many of their early readers, and you see this in private correspondence, in the periodical press, newspapers, magazines, academic journals, most of their early readers also believed that Draper and White were seeking a reconciliation between religion and science. And in particular, a number of religiously liberal magazines on both sides of the Atlantic viewed Draper and White's work as an entirely Protestant project. Well, and this Protestant emphasis is also most clearly spelled out in the criticism they received. Perhaps some of the most perceptive readers came from the Catholic tradition. A reviewer for the Catholic World magazine, for instance, accused Draper of repeating and multiplying old, time-worn, oft-refuted, and ridiculous stories which stain the pages of long-forgotten Protestant controversialists. The same accusation was leveled at White as well. So here's the rub. Their proposals, their arguments were not particularly new. What they did was consolidate a number of narratives that were already in circulation, that were sort of commonplace, and particularly among Protestants, Protestant theologians, Protestant historians, and men and women of science. The conflict they spoke of was an internal one between contending Christian groups. The conflict of warfare, in their views, was not between science or religion, but between contending Protestant traditions. You have in one corner this new theology of liberal Protestantism, which de-emphasized things like scripture, dogmatism, institutionalism, and the like. And the other corner, you have, quote unquote, traditionary faith, creeds, doctrines, orthodoxy, and in general, more conservative Protestantism. And here where things get a little complicated and messy, because neither liberal nor conservative Protestantism was monolithic, right? Think of them as separate streams, or perhaps connected by sort of outlets or inlets. You have this one river and it's just separating. So Draper actually advocated a return to what he called a purer, more rational Christianity. And this, of course, comes from folks like Francis Bacon, John Locke, and even Isaac Newton. All of them look back to the Protestant Reformation as a reformation not only of religion, but science or natural philosophy. Draper also seemed to depend on historians like Edward Gibbon, and often mentions the work of German Lutheran church historian Johann von Moscham and English clergyman Conyers Middleton, William Warburton. So for his understanding of church history, Draper relied almost exclusively on Protestant historians. But Draper's real hero was ultimately Unitarian minister and chemist Joseph Priestley. In one of his lectures to students, Draper tells students that we, quote, we must not impute it to mental weakness that Priestley passed through so many religious beliefs before arriving at Unitarianism, but rather to the pursuit of truth. So clearly, Draper was no atheist. He often spoke about the creator, the great architect, as it were, in his lectures and science textbooks, but he looked back to a more rational Christianity, more rational religion found among 17th and 18th century theologians and historians who viewed the new knowledge, as evidence of the creative power of God, but at the same time downplayed the importance of scripture and church tradition. And this group of Christian thinkers sought not only to demonstrate how God has revealed himself in nature, but how a more rational Protestantism provided an atmosphere more conducive to the sciences. Protestantism, in other words, embodied the principles that would allow for the progress of learning, society, and religion itself. In this sense, Draper can be firmly placed within this particular Protestant tradition. And of course, upon deeper reflection, many of these men, Priestley, Newton, Locke, Bacon, held rather unorthodox views of Christianity, right? Many, if not most, were anti-Trinitarians, and some even denied the divinity of Christ. Deeply impressed by the new learning, they sought to sort of minimize doctrinal discord by emphasizing human reason and understanding revelation. And they frequently preached for a more reasonable Christianity at the pulpit as well. White was in the same Protestant river as Draper again, but again, he was writing it down a different stream or outlet because he did not look to the past, but rather to the future or to contemporary conceptualizations or reconceptualizations of quote unquote religion. Religion is found, White believed, in intuition and sentiment. And this definition of religion, of course, is not new. It exemplified essential elements of a more romantic movement, which had become, by the late 19th century, a central component of liberal Protestant thought. And White loved Germany. While studying in Berlin, he visited Wartburg Castle, where Luther was protected by Prince Frederick. While in Germany, White also studied under Karl Ritter and Leopold von Ranke. He also read Lessing, Goethe, Scheller, Schleiermacher, and other what contemporary scholars call today mediating German theologians. Lessing, for example, talked about the evolution of religion, and he maintained that all faiths lead to one universal truth. So no creed or dogma was complete or final in Lessing's view. Christianity was this ever-evolving thing, just like the rest of civilization. So White had sort of imbibed this idea. It became part of his worldview. Schleiermacher convinced him, moreover, that true religion is not found in doctrine or books or dogma, but intuition, this feeling of absolute dependence, this sort of inward witness of the heart. So Draper and White were flowing down the same liberal Protestant river, but just in different sections. So in a way, you can think of Protestantism as a set of tributaries. Once the Reformation took hold of Europe, it quickly split, though, into different streams of thought and theology. Thus, you can say that Draper followed a religion of the head, whereas White followed a religion of the heart. So one of the guiding questions in my study also is how Draper and White's ideas came to such prominence. How did they become so popular? And it was their books obviously sold very well, and they were of great interest to many people. But the question is more of how did their books become a reality? And central here, beside Draper and White themselves, is a man named Edward Livingstone Yeomans, and he was science editor of D. Appleton and Co., the publishing empire. He published, promoted, defended for an American audience the work of Charles Darwin, Thomas Huxley, Tyndall, Spencer, and many other English and European scientists. And more importantly, Yeomans was the key figure in disseminating and popularizing the narratives of Draper and White. He began publishing their work just as British and American publishing was undergoing a remarkable communication revolution. Indeed, he was sort of at the forefront of this revolution, establishing new international copyright agreements and popularizing scientific knowledge in his extremely successful Popular Science Monthly magazine, which, by the way, is nothing what it is today, very different back then. and the International Scientific Series on the right there. Both were ambitious projects started in 1870s, intent on sort of diffusing the latest advances in science to a more global audience. Now, Humans was also a member of the Free Religious Association, the Free Religious Association. Now, in 1825, the American Unitarian Association was established to promote sort of a more humanistic Christology, a kind of a rationalistic interpretation of Scripture, and an optimistic view of human nature. After the Civil War, though, controversy and schism emerged within the denomination, as some members decided that even Unitarianism was still harbored sort of a residual orthodoxy. Thus, founded in 1867 in Boston, the Free Religious Association sought to promote the principles of free thought and moral philosophy without any reference to institutional Christianity. So it was composed of sort of a diverse assortment of radical Unitarians, Universalists, spiritualists, transcendentalists, scientific theists, and other disaffected religious minorities. The FRA, the Free Religious Association, advanced a new religion of humanity. That's what they call it, a new religion of humanity. And according to its first constitution, the FRA aspired to promote the interest of pure religion. There's that phrase again, pure religion, to encourage the scientific study of theology and to increase fellowship and the spirit. Now, Humans actually served as one of its vice presidents of the FRA. In 1873, at its annual meeting, he delivered an address entitled The Religious Work of Science, The Religious Work of Science. In this speech, he announced that science has long been regarded and still widely believed to be the antagonist of religion. So again, this idea exists at that point. But the time has come, he proclaims, when it will be accepted as its most powerful ally and best friend. Science and religion will be allies and best friends. According to Humans, science and religion are not mutually exclusive. It is the office of science to explore the works of God, of religion to deal with the sentiments and emotions which go out toward the divine author of these works. Science, Humans asserted, was knowledge of the order of nature, the laws by which that order is governed, whereas religion was the feeling entertained toward that infinite being, that power or cause, but whatever name called, of which all things are the manifestation. So men of science, he explained, devote their lives to exploring the works of God, and thus they labor at discovering divine truths in nature. And such work, therefore, is religious work, according to Humans. So as religious work, science has attained its greatest achievement in revealing, and this is again coming from an idea from Lessing, the evolution or growth in religion. So wherever conflict emerged, it occurred not between science and religion, but between theology and science. And Humans believe that theology has always been the adversary of science. Men of science have always faced this opposition, the opposition of theologians who claim to be authorized expounders of the divine policy. So in this sense, Humans saw Draper and White and others like them as peacemakers. He actually called them peacemakers in his magazine. Now, whether or not Humans and the writers he published were actual peacemakers is beside the point. For Humans and for many other Protestant intellectuals, the separation of piety or religious feeling from accepted creeds or orthodoxy provided the means of reconciliation, reconciling the apparent discord between new knowledge and ancient faith. While his religious views were necessarily shared by some similarities to, there are some similarities to liberal Protestantism, Humans ultimately rejected any kind of doctrinal beliefs of traditional Christianity. So while he appropriated and defended Protestant historiography, He did not believe Protestantism, like Draper and White did, would bring about a final reconciliation between science and religion. For humans, the times required a new theology, a freer religion than what has been proposed by even liberal Protestants at the time. But the question remains, why were all these thinkers, why were Draper and White and Humans, why were they misunderstood, or why historians of science have misunderstood them? And I think one reason is that their ideas were quickly appropriated by secularists, free thinkers, atheists at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And perhaps the most important secularist to have appropriated Draper's historical narrative was Joseph McCabe. And there he is. He's a Roman Catholic monk who abandoned his religious beliefs around 1895. McCabe was a prolific author. He wrote something like over 200 books on science, history, and religion. And he was an advocate of atheism. And he frequently forecast the doom of Christianity in light of modern science. And in 1927, he published this little book entitled The Conflict Between Science and Religion. That's a familiar title. McCabe essentially repeated Draper's narrative. He essentially repeated White's narrative, but unlike Draper and White, McCabe gleefully cheered on the decay of religion. Historians of the 21st century, he argued, will look back with amusement at those men of science and theologians who protested that there is no conflict between religion and science. The Christian religion, McCabe contended, was the most deadly opponent of scientific progress. More importantly, however, the vast majority of McCabe's little book here was a diatribe against, quote, progressive religion. And ironically, he repeated the same arguments of conservative and orthodox opponents of Draper and White. McCabe claimed that liberal Protestantism was living in the, quote, land of bunk. So according to McCabe, those liberal theologians who reinterpreted traditional religious beliefs, wittingly or unwittingly, attacked the very foundations of Christianity. So at the beginning of the 20th century, rationalists, free thinkers, secularists, atheists seized upon the historical narratives of Draper and White, other liberal Protestant historians, adopting them as weapons in their campaign to extinguish all religion. And here's the real irony here as well. The secular progressivism or humanism deeply informed the fledgling discipline of the history of science, of religion, the history of science itself, as it developed in the early 20th century. And as I point out in my book, George Sarton, sort of the so-called father of the history of science discipline, had appropriated the general outline nuance. As he himself put it, the history of science is a story of an endless struggle against superstition and error. So Sarton believed that men of science are heroes fighting for truth against the forces of darkness, and the enemies are religion and superstition in every shape and form. So what you ultimately see in my book and other things that I've published is a series of unintended consequences. You have this Protestant anti-Catholic polemic that was used by the reformers and early Protestant thinkers, used against the Catholic Church. This polemic was quickly appropriated, though, by contending Protestant groups. They used it against each other. You know, they would make the claim, don't be like the Catholics who are irrational or who refuse to study the natural world. But then this narrative, this polemic was ultimately appropriated by free thinkers and atheists at the end of the 19th century and used as a weapon against all forms of religious belief. So that's that.
Thank you, James.
Welcome. So if you guys have any questions about the presentation or about the article, or if you've read the book, please let's talk about it. Carl, go ahead.
Thank you. Really interesting paper. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, as I mentioned before, I used to shovel snow for George Mossey. My
Oh,
Well,
okay.
My
Yeah.
wife's parents lived next door, and
Okay.
the idea of inter-Protestant
Hmm.
uh, inter-Protestant disputes being a factor here, I find really interesting. And let me cite 2 or 3 points
Sure.
and maybe have you comment. Number one, Bob Kingdon, who taught in the history department, actually I took a seminar.
Hmm.
Bob said that actually the higher criticism of the Bible is a Protestant attempt to discern the plain sense of the text.
Hmm.
So it's actually in intent no different from fundamentalism. It's just a different way of discerning the plain sense where you get this divergence. So that's one observation. A second observation, as Lily mentioned, I've recently written a book about Calvin. 2009 was Calvin's, the 500th anniversary of his birth.
Hmm.
And as a result, there was an outpouring of monographs in celebration of this event.
Hmm.
And if you got into the monographs, you found that there was actually a kind of a Berlin Wall that divided those Calvin scholars who argued that Calvin was a biblical inerrantist, and those scholars who argued that Calvin could not have been a biblical inerrantist.
Okay.
So you get all these appreciations of Calvin, but ultimately divided by a view of biblical inerrancy, which I think is somehow entailed in your story. And I would just reflect that, in America, biblical inerrancy as sort of an intellectual discipline is a product of the old Princeton Theological Seminary, which goes back then to debate other Protestant debates with Catholics.
Hmm.
Those Calvinists or scholars who claim Calvin was not an inerrantist, tend to follow, 20th century neo-orthodox developments like Karl Barth, read Calvin as through a Barthian lens. Anyway, those are just some reflections, but I found the paper really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. I haven't. I've studied Calvin, but not in. Probably not in as detailed as you. But the idea of biblical criticism played a huge role on how Draper and White conceptualized their arguments as well. You look at White's very last chapter, massive chapter in his 2-volume masterpiece, and it's completely dedicated to what he called the scientific interpretation of the Bible. And he's tracing the history of biblical criticism, and it played a huge role in how he reconceptualized religion. And even Draper, there's a correspondence in Draper, and it's very difficult to read, but what I've been able to pick out from what he wrote in this correspondence is that he used to believe in the miracles of the New Testament, the miracles of the Old Testament as well. But then he learned what the German critics were doing, and that changed everything. So biblical criticism played a huge factor in how these two men, and probably how Thomas Henry Huxley, John Tyndall, and a lot of these other guys in the late Victorian period, how they reconceptualized religion and how they talked about the relationship between religion and science. So that's a huge role. Like I was saying earlier, Nathan and a few others, we published a series of articles in Zygon where we talk a little bit about that, the nature of biblical criticism and how it affected this dialogue in the late Victorian period. Adam looks like he has a question.
I really liked your talk too. Thank you so much. So I am an historian of the university and a historian of higher education in general. So your characters are familiar to me. And the book that I found myself thinking about when I was listening was Julie Rubin's book, on the making of the modern university and the marginalization of morality.
Yeah,
and characters sort of play into that story. And what I wanted maybe to hear more about was how White, who is a college president, and others thought that this conflict should be taught or communicated not just through their publications, but through, sort of their public role for people, the American public in general, and then looking back. So not just to a scholarly community. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about how they tried to communicate their views of the conflict broadly.
Well, your point about Julia's book is really important because I think if my memory serves me right, I think she shows how White was influenced by a lot of these other presidents of these new schools, and you wouldn't call them secular, you would call them non-sectarian. They were not atheistic. They just refused to get into theological debate and wrangling. So that, again, that's all part of White's understanding of religion, of theology, and he's popularizing this idea that it's not a conflict between science and religion, but he's separating religious feeling, religious sentiment, which is different from theology. Theology is sort of this intellectual attempt of understanding religion, and that's where things get murky because in a way, I would say that White is agnostic when it comes to like ultimate questions of God, of Christianity, of different religions. He's open to it, but again, this is kind of a very much watered down understanding of what religion is, divorced completely from theology. And I've labeled these guys in my book as sort of a Protestantism minus Christianity. They still hold to Protestant language, Protestant history, but they've completely rejected traditional Orthodox Christianity. So again, he's not trying to undermine religious faith as he understands it, but he is trying to question theology and question the theologians.
Yeah, another book that came to mind, I know Thomas has a question, so I'm just going to mention the book, is Andy Jewett's book on sort of Deweyism in the American University, but he's now working much more closely on some of the questions that you've written about. So thank you, I love it.
Great.
Hi, my question was, I went back to thinking back at the beginning of your discussion, and you discussed this phrase I wrote down, the paganism of Christianity versus
paganization of Christianity.
Paganization of Christianity versus true religion, whatever that may be.
Right.
And is that just a sort of a footnote that is the starting point for these writers, or do they go into that any deeper to try to tease out the differences? Maybe the
in the 17th and 18th century, there's this entire genre of literature called pagano-papism, where they basically argued that the papacy, Roman Catholic Church, were paganized. They were corrupted by pagan Greek ideas, Hellenistic ideas, and that kind of pulled away from the original, pure, simple message of Christianity, of Christ. So that definitely plays a role. And again, this is very much a Protestant narrative. This is a Protestant way of talking about the history of Christianity. And they were definitely drawing from that tradition.
But don't you think that the Protestant tradition is also just a different form of paganization?
No comment there.
Okay.
Okay, I don't want to jump in. Nathan, you want to go first, or can I have a? Okay.
You can go. Yeah.
Well, okay. Thanks, James. Great talk. Thank you. I wonder if you can kind of extend the storyline a little bit more into the 20th century. So I was obviously coming from Germany. I felt very much on familiar grounds, the way you described this conflict. But I wonder when, so the way you presented these historians of science as liberal Protestants, if you will, when do we lose this storyline in the 20th century? Today, it strikes me very much that what McCabe wrote, the conflict between religion and science, that today is a conflict between the Daniel Dennett's and so people who reject religion outright, don't see anything, don't look at nature as a form of creation, and have given up on any kind of religious idea or way or a way of thinking about the natural universe. When do we lose the religious component or the religious aspect of that non-orthodox, non-conservative perspective on science?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question to answer, because to some extent it's those distinctions are still present among certain Protestant denominations, certain Protestant groups. But I think what you see happening, and I've been reading a really great book by Stephen Wilden right now, and he's talking about the rise of American secular humanism. I don't have the book in front of me right now, unfortunately, but I can look it up and I can send you guys a link. But it's a great book because he's talking about the rise of the Humanist Manifesto in the 1930s. One he makes, and he makes this correctly, is that the first manifesto, I think it was published in 1937, 1935, all signed by liberal Protestant ministers. There's not one scientist who signed that document. The second manifesto was signed by several more philosophers and actual practicing scientists, but that manifesto was signed by liberal Protestant ministers. It was written by a liberal Protestant minister. And what for me, what I think is interesting, because you see this sort of attack on traditional, more orthodox Christian beliefs, and at the same time, you see the rise of Christian fundamentalism at the same time. So they're sort of almost feeding off of each other. The fundamentals, I think, was published in sometime in the 1920s, sometime in the 1930s, roughly about the same time. So if you read the fundamentals are written by academics and fairly intelligent theologians and historians, and they're reacting to what they're seeing is sort of this dissolving of traditional Christianity. What happens later with the creationists, I don't know. But it's all part of the mix, right? So you see these people in the early 20th century, they're recognizing that there's some kind of issue going on. And I think here, Dan helped me out here, Dan Homo, he wrote the Fundamentals, published 1910 to 1915. So again, they're reacting to what they're perceiving as sort of dissolving of traditional Christian thought. But then you have documents like the Human Manifesto that are also reacting towards the fundamentals. So they're going back and forth with each other. And again, I don't think there's like an end point where the separation between sort of the liberal Protestant way of thinking about the relationship of religion and science sort of ended, because again, I think there's still some of that sentiment going on among liberal Protestants today, where they look at theology and they say theology is bad, dogmatism, we don't want that, you know. And I've read this on a few more contemporary works that theology is something that's evolving, and Christianity is something that's evolving, and we should embrace that. Again, those are ideas that go all the way back to Draper and White. And even though these liberal Protestants, I think, would say, no, we reject Draper and White, in a way, they're misunderstanding what Draper and White is saying, because what they're saying is exactly what Draper and White said. So it's a funny, it's an issue of, I think, not reading carefully what you perceive as your opponent or your opposing sort of enemies in the discussion. Does that make sense? Does that help at all? Yeah, okay. Who's next?
Oh yeah. I had it. Well, 2 points actually, and a point and then a question. I think the first point is I think in relation to kind of contextualizing the. I think I sent you an email about this actually. Contextualizing the kind of this history even more. I think it's become more interesting to me to kind of see it as a very European and American kind of narrative, which, yeah, as far as I'm starting to see, particularly like in the Eastern world, you don't really get this kind of history and narrative almost at all. It's completely different, and like certain events in the early church, certain schisms and so forth, kind of enable this separation, which kind of provides the Reformation period with this kind of narrative that goes against the Catholics, and then you get to kind of 19th century and you get this kind of narrative against, I guess, orthodox kind of Christianity and stuff. But yeah, I think that is, because I think what your kind of argument does is kind of essentially says that, but it is interesting to note stuff like the freethinkers and atheists at the end of the 19th century, for example, were predominantly white. And as one scholar, I think it's called Christian Cameron, has noted, for example, black freethinkers, their arguments usually didn't hinge on, let's say, the history of science or anything like that. It was more on the history of slavery under, of course, Christianity. But that also just, I think, goes to show how non-universal this kind of narrative of science and religion really is. It's very, very European kind of narrative mixed with America, of course. So I think that's an important, that's just a point which maybe you could comment on. The question I did have was, so like people like William Leakey, or Lecky, however you say it, not entirely sure, and Draper and others were writing these histories of Europe and rationalism and all of these things. And I'm wondering essentially who else was doing this. If I know William Leakey's book was obviously very popular in 1865, but and I know quite a few people were doing it, but were there any other like really popular ones, I guess, apart from Draper?
I think you mentioned one of them, right? Leakey or Lakey?
Yeah, however, I don't know how to say it, so I just say.
Yeah. So again, what Draper was doing, Draper was notoriously bad for not citing anyone, whereas White, he cited just about everything he could get a hand on. He does massive footnotes in White's 2 volumes, whereas Draper cites no one. But he does refer occasionally to certain authors. And again, this is an issue of having to read it very carefully in order to see who he's referring to. And he does refer to people like Gibbon and even Hume. He referred to David Hume as well. So he's not looking so much at the contemporary scene. He's kind of old school. He's looking back at the 18th century. So his references mostly scholars, mostly thinkers from the 18th century and not the 19th century. So I don't think he ever mentions Leakey, but there were people like Leakey. There were people like who is that guy who Robert Chambers, publisher of Vestiges of let me look up his name. I believe it's Robert Chambers.
You mean Vestiges of the Natural History?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And his narrative is strikingly similar to narrative to Draper's when he's talking about the history of Christianity, history of Protestantism. So again, Robert Chambers was born in, let's see, 1802 to 1875. And Draper and Chambers actually had a kind of a lengthy correspondence. Chambers invited Draper over to his home after he gave his notorious 1860 paper at Oxford. This is right before Thomas Henry Huxley and Wilberforce got into their infamous debate. But Chambers really liked Draper and invited him over to his home. And what's interesting about the correspondence between Draper and Chambers is that Chambers is trying to convince Draper about spiritualism. Chambers was an advocate of spiritualism, and he went to seances, and he felt like he could tap into the spiritual world. He believed they were scientifically demonstrable, whereas Draper told him, you know, I've never been to one, but I'll give it a go. But you know, the correspondence is very interesting because it shows that Chambers was very much into this field where Draper had already kind of given up hope tapping into the spiritual world at that point in the 1860s.
I see. I didn't know that, actually. That's interesting because it's similar to Alfred Russel Wallace, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, okay, cool. Thanks. That's appreciated.
Yeah, I have I don't know if I'm just going to repeat what Ulrich was saying. I feel like what I think is interesting. I mean, I think the way that you hash this out as like an intra-Protestant debate that kind of gets repeated then outside of itself with McCabe, and even you mentioned a little bit some more contemporary figures in the journal article, but it felt all this felt very contemporary. It feels like people recycle all of the same arguments, and that the distribution of authority like hasn't really changed. Like I'm thinking about, I don't know, I think the idea of science transforming religion, I feel like that was something I talked about with my brother like a week ago. And at the same time, like thinking about like more conservative Christian communities I've been a part of, like, and even just my childhood, I can remember when I think the idea of evolution by natural selection seemed like a kind of a threatening, kind of religiously threatening, you know, or just like, oh yeah, there is some sense of like difference or irreconcilability. And I mean, I guess just I'm sort of interested in how we move beyond wherever the antagonism actually is, whether it's in some relationship to scripture, to tradition, to different ways of knowing how we kind of adjudicate their authority. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of me wants to ask how to move beyond this kind of intra-Protestant debate. Would there have to be some kind of new religious kind of paradigm, or the weight or emphasis? Obviously, a lot of this is happening in the United States, which is kind of an unfurling of different Protestant logics. But that may be too big of a question to just ask you what the solution is.
No, it's a great question. And I come from that background myself. It's not easy to find an answer. You know, the thing that I'm always so surprised is that you look at creationist movements, and they've been expanding. There are huge movements of creationism in Germany, in even the Netherlands and France. And these organizations are growing. But what's striking about this growth is that the leaders of these organizations typically have PhDs in the sciences. You know, I think there's an organization in France with a PhD. The leader of the organization is a PhD in mathematics. There's a PhD in chemistry or biology. So these are intelligent people who are supporting creationism. So I think the old idea, the idea from the new atheists that these people are stupid or dumb is just, it's dishonest, really. Because they're not stupid, they're not dumb, they're very intelligent people. But what's happening here, again, it's an internal religious conflict, how they go about interpreting scripture, what Carl was talking about, the sort of the literalist interpretation, having a more better understanding of how these ancient documents, these ancient sacred documents were written, their intentions. That's something that needs to be talked about between Protestant groups, because I mean, my interaction with Protestants, with Christians in general, they're not dumb people. They're very intelligent people, and a lot of them, because they feel like they have a lot at stake, they learn about science, and they teach themselves how science operates, and a lot of times they know more about more about the science than I do. But again, what's happening is that there's something different within their theological system, how they think about theology, how they think about the Old Testament, how they think about the New Testament. So in a way, I feel like the approach of a lot of sort of science Christian organizations today, where they talk about science-engaged theology, I think that is the wrong approach, because I think that automatically shuts people who are, I think, on the more conservative side when it comes to Christianity. It shuts down the conversation. They automatically shut down. You have to reach them at a more common ground, and that's with theology. That's with biblical studies. So before you can teach them about sort of a sacred ecology, a theology of ecology, you need to find common ground theologically with them. What's the most essential? What's the most important aspect of the theology, and meet them there, and show them that historically, the church fathers had a very high regard for creation, for nature, and they saw themselves as stewards of nature, as caretakers of nature, not as someone who dominates nature and abuses it. And you find that common ground theologically, biblically, and then I think they become more open to what's happening, things like climate change and other issues going on in the sciences as well. I mean, that's my perspective. You got to reach them first at a theological level, biblical level, before you can start pushing the science in front of them. Because again, a lot of times they know the science, but they just don't agree with the scientists, with the experts. Go ahead, Carl. You look like you have something. And Adam too.
I find this discussion very interesting. Just maybe 3 observations about the scientists and biblical inerrancy. I think that's a failure of the humanities, or a failure of philosophy. I think of an analog is the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who's actually quite prominent. I think he's now retired from Notre Dame, and he's prominent among the so-called Reformed epistemologists.
That's right, yeah.
Which is actually a way of defending biblical literalism, or a literal attachment to Christian belief, which I think is completely false. So he incorporates Christian belief within an analytic philosophical framework, and within that framework makes the claim that in Reformed terms, Christian belief can be a form of knowledge. And he's prominent. I mean, he's published at Oxford, and he's prominent within his own profession. But I think unsophisticated, and which leads to another question about going to Uli's question. I think what we're dealing with not only is the issue of between science and religion, but what C.P. Snow called the 2 cultures, which is to say there's an utter disconnect between the science and the humanities. And for me, the problem, because I've encountered it, the sophisticated scientifically or engineering, people trained in engineering who are fundamentalists, is their utter lack of understanding of anything within the tradition we call humanities. So it's been a kind of a failure of the humanities, I think, from my point of view. But I think that Snow's 2 cultures is part of what's going on here.
I mean, I guess you can make the argument that's a failure of the humanities, but I think the wider culture, we're looking more and more to the scientific experts than to the philosopher or to the historian, right? I think we're at a place in the culture, and this has a long history, and you can actually trace it back to people like Isaac Newton, where the scientist is the sort of the new priest. He becomes a new priest, a new clergy, and we look up to them, and they have authority and they have expertise, and because of that, in a way, they feel like they don't need to study philosophy, they don't need to study history because they have expertise, they have the knowledge. And universities are operating this way now too. I mean, look look who has the funding at most universities, who has the huge buildings, who has it's the sciences. The sciences are well endowed and respected, and the funding goes to them and not to the humanities, not to guys like me or Nathan or David, religious studies scholars and historians. So it's part of a wider culture. I don't think you can blame the humanities completely, but I think it's part of it, but it's something wider than that, I think, right?
I have a question that picks up on some earlier themes about looking both within Protestantism and then outside of Protestantism, and also looking back to the sort of earlier 19th and even 18th century that you link us up to. So what I was thinking about is, aside from some aspects of the natural sciences, being the physical and biological sciences that we're talking about, thinking about the development of what we would in the 20th century come to call the human sciences or the social sciences in this period. I'm thinking of comparative theologies and comparative anthropologies, and the way somebody like Priestley, who writes on the Institutes of Moses and the Hindus, is in touch with Sir William Jones and thinking about, the Sanskritists and their discoveries, are in touch with various other comparative theologians and what they would think of as comparative ethnologists, but comparative anthropologists in that period, who are engaged in a certain relativizing of Christianity and therefore Protestantism within a broader world system of religions or differences of religions.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can speak to how your characters are tapped into that discussion as one that is raising questions about universality of religious experience, and certainly ecclesiastical forms, right. and belief systems attached to those ecclesiastical forms, so that we can sort of get a better handle on what science includes in your story, because it goes way beyond the biological and physical sciences or Newton and Darwin, into the human and ultimately social sciences as they're evolving in the late 18th and especially into the 19th century.
Yeah, Adam, I'm glad you asked that question, because that has been an absolutely neglected area when it comes to understanding Draper and White and history of science among historians of science in general, because Draper and White, again, not only biblical studies, but the sort of comparative mythology, comparative religious studies was just forming at the time, mid-19th century, and that played a huge role in their thinking as well. If you look at Draper's narrative, maybe not his history of conflict, but his bigger book, the development of Europe, full of mythology, full of understanding of Greek mythology, Roman mythology, even Hindu mythology. So he playing a role in how he talks about the relationship of religion and science. And the fact that he starts with Greek mythology and how some Greek thinkers opposed scientific progress shows you that Draper was not just simply talking about the Catholic tradition or the Christian tradition. Now he's arguing that there's this idea within a certain segment of religious people, religious thinkers, has always been, even among the Greeks, have always been conservative or traditionalists, and they oppose progress and new knowledge. So that played a role in Draper and White, and even played a role in Isaac Newton. And not many people know this, but Isaac Newton wrote more on theology and mythology and biblical studies than he ever did on mathematics and his sciences. There's a massive collection of unpublished manuscripts that Newton, for different reasons, never published. And he's diving into this comparative religious studies, comparative mythological studies that was just beginning. And a lot of this information comes from missionaries, so it's kind of questionable, but you know, it's important because it's helping them understand what religion is. It's helping them conceptualize what religion is. And typically they're moving more towards this idea that religion is something that, and they're doing this for a specific reason, that the religion is something that's more internal, and they're doing this for a specific reason because they've experienced the religious wars. They've experienced the bloodshed of religious infighting for decades, and they're looking for a more, they're hoping that a more rationalized, a more simplistic, more pure understanding of religion would solve the issue. Apparently it doesn't, but this is what they're doing. They're using these sources. They're looking at, oh, look, these common elements in different religious traditions. And religion becomes corrupted once it has power, once it's politicized or materialized, like Draper said. So we need to step away from that, because that brought warfare, that's brought bloodshed. So we need to step away from that. We need to cleanse that. We need to purify that. So the rise of religious studies helps them understand that. And whether or not the earliest text on comparative religious studies was honest, or they really understood what Chinese religion was doing, or what Confucianism was, or anything like that, or Buddhism, I think that's beside the point. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to find this kind of pure natural religion coming into play, and they're hoping that this natural religion will solve the problems of religious warfare.
Maybe have time for one or two more questions if there are any, but we've had a pretty good discussion so far.
Yeah, I have one more, but since it's late for me over here, I hope we don't have another long round. But I have to ask still. So the name I haven't heard tonight in this conversation is Charles Darwin.
Mm.
And of course now, so he is kind of the one who changes the whole discourse, starting out as a student of divinity, and then struggling with that. And after his voyage with the Beagle and so on and so on and so on. But how does he fit into your story, and how does he change the equation? And that is my last question, and I don't have a follow-up. And David will close our meeting tonight. But I'm just curious if you can do this with a few short sentences. Where does he fit? That would be fantastic.
It's a great question. It's an interesting question because.
And thanks for your talk again.
Oh, no problem. It's a great question. It's an interesting question because I would have to say Darwin's impact wasn't very significant for Draper and White. Interestingly enough, again, White was a historian. He was a man of literature. He didn't really pay attention to the details of Darwin's theory of evolution. He embraced it, but I don't think he really understood it very well. I think he embraced more of Herbert Spencer's idea of cosmic evolution. And I think Draper as well. I think Draper promoted more of a Lamarckian understanding of evolution versus Darwin's theory of natural selection. But what's interesting about Darwin himself, he's another character here that is influenced by things like biblical criticism. He in his autobiography, he attributed biblical criticism as one of the reasons why he turned into agnostic, why he stopped believing, kind of dissolved his whatever religious Christian background he had. So there's almost a kind of a rivalry between Draper and Darwin in a way. I mean, Draper wanted to promote Darwin as a practicing scientist, but he again disagreed with the mechanism of his understanding of evolution. And what's really interesting is that when humans published a sort of an obituary of Darwin in his Popular Science Monthly, he also included Draper because they died around the same time. So Humans is putting up Darwin as the evolutionary scientist in England, in the UK, that made a huge impact, whereas Humans is also putting Draper as the American with the American chemist who had just the equal impact on science. So no one really talks about Draper as a scientist anymore, right? So it's I find it ironic that we put up Darwin when back in the day Draper was considered on equal footing with Darwin, at least for someone like Edward Humans.
Satisfying closure here for us. James, thank you very much for your great talk, the book, and just I don't know, really enjoyed. I could tell that this is a lot of this stuff is like kind of like interesting and live for you, which I know it is for all academics, but I think it's good to see some enthusiasm. So everybody, join me. Just thank James one more time here for this.
Thank you for the great questions. I appreciate it. And I think you have my email address, contact information. If anybody has any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to start a conversation. So,
sounds great. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back. We'll be back in a month. I think Brandon Block is our presenter, who's normally here, but not here today. But take care, everybody.
You guys have a good night.
Some guests here today. Take care.